Welcome everyone. We start almost on time, adhering to German punctuality, which I have to admit I'm not good at. But anyways, you'll hear me speak now for the next 20-25 minutes. I'm Hanna, I'm the CEO and co-founder, but also because you see I'm pregnant, I cannot talk that well anymore. I brought some support. My co-founder Lisa, who's actually also the voice of our customers and can share some very interesting anecdotes. And also if I get out of breath, she might have to take over completely, which I think she hopes she doesn't have to. But anyway, starting with a few words about myself. So one of three co-founders, and actually my connection to the topic started when I moved across the globe myself. And there were a lot of interesting places I moved to, and it was always challenging. And like the more I did it, I thought it's getting easier, but it actually didn't. Moved to China, there housing was an interesting challenge. Moved to the Dominican Republic, where the kind of settling in was an interesting process. Had my fair share of issues with U.S. immigration, and so I think there, it's often about finding the right information, having people who can support you. But I really think there, for people who want to move across the globe, the border and the blocker is still there. So very personal motivation, but also actually because I studied engineering, I work in consulting, I always try analyze things, and then I actually realized when I looked into the space that it's a very, very interesting industry as well. A lot changed, and I think generally when we look at it, a lot of change happened, of course, in the last 5 years, but also before. If we look at it 20 years ago, global mobility was much more of a niche phenomenon only for senior managers. It was a very, very small overall population that was moved by companies. And I think that is really something that's drastically changing. But of course, the relocation industry is still not 100% ready for that. And it was also interesting when we look at our founding story, because Lisa actually knows the story from a company perspective. And we've known each other for a long time, but I never really understood what she was doing until I started diving into the industry, because she was actually moving people for a company. And then the dots connected, we founded Localyze, and I think one of the interesting things, and also how our story shaped what we do, is that we didn't always just want to solve it for companies, but also for the talents. And I think the focus on the talents and what you can do for them. And also I think they're frankly, I'll come to that later, but in today's markets where of course there's also pressure on cost, etc., talent-driven mobility, you can think about it very differently. And I think they're also looking at how does talent actually need to have their problem solved? Gives you a bit of a unique approach, I would say. But yeah, also because global mobility is becoming more and more complex, and I think now rather looking at the last 5 years, with COVID, remote work, etc. There's so many new aspects, and global mobility is suddenly touching so many more topics. So talent acquisition, I think that's been the case for a longer time, but also now with remote work, short-term moves abroad, etc. There's a whole new complexity added, and so that's why also with today's event, our goal is to really tackle the problem more broadly, inviting different stakeholders. So you also see it in our list of panelists and speakers. There is a variety of job titles displayed as well, because it's not just global mobility professionals anymore who think about the topic, and I think that's a great opportunity as well. And speaking about today's event, we have a great agenda prepared. You'll also see me in some of the panels, especially in the morning. But then in the afternoon, Lisa is also diving deeper into immigration and also what's happening in Germany. We look at the bigger picture. We look at different angles. We also have one specific panel for the flexible working, short-term work abroad, and remote work. So I'm really excited. We also have networking opportunities in between, so very much looking forward to that. But before we start into that, there's a bit more of a monologue from my side, which is called a keynote. So the next 15-20 minutes, you'll hear from me and from Lisa. Also some of the findings, and I think they're maybe also looking a bit into what we do at Localyze, and how we try and work with the industry. Because there's so much changing, We try and like stay close to all of the trends. We have a report that I'll speak about later as well, but we also have a product advisory board that we work with very closely. We do customer interviews, really trying to like see, okay, how are different companies solving the problem? Because I do think right now it's very dynamic industry and there's a lot changing, and like we want to be part of that. And maybe diving right in into, oops, now that I'm clicking a bit too hard, I think. Looking at like especially the last like 5 to 10 years, what I mentioned already is that previously global mobility was more of a niche phenomenon. I think like what then happened, and it's an interesting trend and like interesting also programs and like case types that you've started seeing. I think back in the day when I applied for jobs for the first time, actually international trainee programs were something that for a lot of people was an interesting factor to look at, okay, like what company has an international trainee program so that I can spend some time abroad. I think like then, of course, in the last 5 years, COVID massively changed the way that we work, but I think like also actually showed to companies what is possible. And right now, it's, yeah, the trends, I would say, especially in the last years, have been more towards a decrease in flexibility. But I think like also there now, it is actually the time like where we should look at why is that happening and like how can we still enable people moving across borders? Because I do think the very big underlying trend is that the world is becoming more and more international. People want to spend some part of their career abroad. And so I think like right now, despite the short-term things that are happening, return to office, now is a time where we can really shape how companies look at global mobility and like how we can enable things. One thing I mentioned in the report, and one of the interesting findings that we had in there when we started looking at like how do we connect global mobility as well, and like what business priorities can we support? A very big factor is like growing internationally. 64% of the people that we surveyed said that that is a priority, and I think like that is something where we can like very well connect global mobility to it, which of course is also important because like if we connect global mobility to strategic topics, bigger likelihood to get a budget, which I think like right now is something that we heard from a lot of people that it's not easy to unlock. And here also because I spoke about our customers, now I need to see that I don't press too hard. Nice. Wanted to hand over to Lisa because she's actually the one like speaking more with customers and like hearing a few first-hand anecdotes.
Yeah, thank you. And as Hanna mentioned, I worked on the company side before and also worked in the immigration space. So when we founded the company, my nickname was Visa Lisa. I think most of you know the story already, but it's just great. So I'm just telling all of you again. And in terms of our customers, I think Hanna mentioned it already. Cost cutting is still a topic. Also like the budget, it is not getting easier. So I think like cost cutting is still something companies looking at. Also the path to profitability is also something we are hearing from quite a few customers. And I think this is just like something we have to keep in mind, even though we are doing the budget planning for 2025 now, sometimes even 2026, let's see. But I think that's really something all of us need to have in mind also for future planning. And this is actually also bringing the employee perspective into the game, because I think employees do want more flexibility. We mentioned it already, like the vacations, short-term moves, relocations. I think like a lot of companies do feel that employees want to have like this flexibility, and it's really like sometimes it's really tough to see, okay, like what do we actually want to enable, and where also as a company do we say, okay, like this is not possible. So this is really something what I'm hearing a lot right now. We actually also did quite a few workshops around policy building with our customers. So if you're interested, there's another one in October, another one in November, and there it was also like super interesting to see, okay, like some of our vocations are ready already, others not. Some are thinking about it, but I'm just not sure how to do it. So I think that was really like something which stood out to me. And then really thinking about, okay, do we also need more providers, or like different providers, because you have workation providers, you have all-in-one solutions like us, who also provide everything, but at the same time, I think that's also interesting. Also, if you think about like connecting these systems with each other, so integrations will play a more important role in the future as well. So yeah, these are definitely things I heard a lot in the past few weeks from our customers. And I think I'm handing over again.
Yes. Now, because we want to dive a bit deeper into 3 different pillars that we've specifically heard and that I think like are also shaping global mobility planning for next year. One, the increasing complexity and also the status in global mobility. And I do think like right now there's a bit of a mismatch that we're hearing between topics where global mobility is pulled into, but then also like it doesn't come with the adequate decision power and like having a seat at the table for strategic discussions. An interesting factor in all of that is also, no, I forgot to click, I'm sorry, but also it's just the title there. I think like where does global mobility actually sit within the company? It's an interesting fact to look at because of course like where you sit in the company determines what budgets you can unlock, but also determines like what decisions you're involved in. And I think like there right now, one thing that we've seen is that of course like sometimes that has been switching from you have like total rewards and benefits, people ops, sometimes you have global mobility in TA, but generally then you look at it a bit more narrowly, whereas I think now strategically, the involvement in international expansion, new locations, where we're going into, where is it maybe also complex to bring people to? I think like those are decisions where global mobility could theoretically shape the discussion with leadership, for example, and also save companies like time and money, because like sometimes there are things where like you think it's easy to enter a country, but like then if it's very hard to like either recruit talent there or bring them there, that might change also the timeline. And one thing also there, finding from our report, 4 in 10 people leaders still don't have an active say in the decision making. So I do think like they're very, very often, it's still a very operational role and like rather seen as like decisions are made and then things have to be executed. And I really think like that is a shame and that's something that we can work on, but like it always needs arguments because also as a CEO, I know there's always a million fires, a lot of things are burning, and like, what are you actually prioritizing? It's not an easy decision, and that is also why we are here today, because like we want to give those arguments. We want to really see how can we make sure that in the future, global mobility is involved a bit more. And now I'm handing over to Lisa again, because like fighting for a seat on the table, she can maybe give some tips.
No, that's too much. No, I'm just kidding. But I think you actually said it well at the very beginning, because also if I look at our customers, how they're structured, I think it's still interesting where global mobility is sitting. I think like some companies do have like even separate global mobility teams, who are really only focused on that topic, also like topic experts. Then we also have one customer here who doesn't even have an HR team, so that's also very special. So I think like their global mobility is basically everywhere. And you also sometimes have like people ops, kind of departments who are doing global mobility, but I also know that global mobility is sometimes sitting with the recruiters because they hire people from abroad, and then it's like logical that they also take care of the visa process, but that's of course like a totally different thing. So I think it's like still interesting to see, okay, where is global mobility actually sitting in the organization? And also what Hanna said related to the ops function or the strategic function. I think I spoke to actually one person today already who said we kind of really made the transition into a more strategic function. So we are also supporting the C-level with these like kind of more strategic decisions when it comes to expansion, etc., which I found super interesting. And I think like this is still something which is lacking and where also global mobility expert and teams need to fight for. And last week I was in Frankfurt at the Global Mobility Leaders Exchange together with Don, Sibyl, and a few others, and there we also discussed the topic. So I think it's like really top of mind and like super interesting to see, okay, like where is global mobility sitting and where it should sit going forward. And there were a few people who actually said that they are part of like the extended leadership team or the broader leadership team and actually have a say in these decisions, but that was not the norm.
Thank you. Another topic, which is adjacent, is also like strategizing for next year. And I think like there's some of the arguments that we mentioned can help us. And also what are companies prioritizing and how are they gaining the seat at the table? What are the arguments that are being used? And there also, again, I won't read all of that loud, but now I think like the report that we have like is really something that might give you some good arguments that you can use, and like also some examples from potential customers and companies that we are talking to. I think like Telefonica is a very, very interesting one because like, of course, on one hand, the flexibility and hybrid working models are something that they're looking at, but then also on the like immigration relocation side, bringing in tech, bringing in a solution like Localyze to really make things a bit more dynamic and like actually help with an increased demand as well. And I think like there are also the short and long-term mobility programs, and like looking at both is something that helps, because with short-term mobility, one thing that we've seen a lot right now, that this is like something that senior leadership cares about because there's liability issues. I think like compliance, liability is something that a lot of people like rings a bell. It frightens people, and like then they want to find solutions. And I think like that is also easier than to unlock budgets. And I think like they're also interesting, like the growing demands by talents, younger generations with flexible working. And I think like also there, if we look at the return to office mandates that we are seeing more and more right now, flexible working policies are actually like something that then a lot of companies are seeing as kind of like a middle ground where they can still offer moves across borders, maybe for a shorter period of time, even though they make the decision that generally they want to have an office culture. And I do think there it's going to be interesting to see where we settle on. And also there, especially for larger companies, one thing that we've seen is that short-term work abroad is something that's often been pushed by workers' councils as well. And so I do think they're looking at like who are actually the advocates and like who can help within the organization to like shape the topic. And I think like that is like really something like where when we look at the strategy and like how can we bring global mobility to the forefront, and I think like also there, especially in 25, because it's the first year where it seems like we can like plan a bit more ahead and like long term. I think like now going in and like saying why should this be something that is considered within the wider people strategy. But again, handing over to Lisa.
You mentioned a few things already, I have to say. Return to office. Amazon, 5 days a week. I think that all of us heard about that. I also met the global mobility lead of Amazon last week, and she was just like, yeah, what can I say? So I think she was also not a big fan of that, but we also have quite a few customers who say, okay, like we're currently looking at it, and there is like a policy of returning to office 3 days per week. Some even do 5. So I think like that's really an interesting development. And I also know that especially like bigger companies, corporates are looking into that at the current time. So I think like that's really interesting to see, and also like interesting to see, okay, like how is that actually developing, because it has an impact on global mobility. Because if you really say, okay, like everyone needs to go back to the office, relocation of course plays another big factor here. Flexible work policies, I think we spoke about that already. I think like companies are also sometimes still in the trialing phase kind of, so they try things out, see, okay, like what's working, what's not working, but like at least from my perspective, I have the feeling like that in 2025, it's really like kind of the time where you need to think about, okay, like what is actually our strategy now? Like what do we do? What are we also not doing? And also communicating that to the employees. So I think like that would also be my big advice for the next few months, probably, to just like really think about, okay, like what do we actually want to offer? Because I think you cannot do everything, but you also need to see, okay, like what's actually like feasible, but what's also like needed from the employees, and what do they prefer? And the budgets I spoke about already, so I won't dive deeper into that because it's just also not such a sexy topic, I have to say. And then last but not least, I also spoke about that already, consolidation of providers. So thinking about, okay, like what then, if we think about like the global mobility programs or strategies we want to offer, what kind of providers do we actually need, and which kind of countries? So I think that's another big topic for next year.
And one thing when we look at next year and also what we really need to have in mind, because I think like right now, often when we look at newspapers, when we look at like the general debate about like migration, immigration, the political environment does not make it easier and more appealing for companies to look into it. It's getting harder, and I think like also there, I have heard a few companies say that now it's like even harder to make it a priority. But on the other hand, I think like right now the argument is that long term we're not getting around big investments in global mobility. And I think like their blue collar is actually an area where we are seeing that now there's a bit of a breaking point. We see more and more companies in Germany, for example, as well, like who operated in German previously and like now see that with that strategy we cannot continue. We start seeing a lot of interest, the blue collar area, and I think like that is of course like something that we've seen already a lot like in the last years. And I think they're just looking at like statistics, where are we going, where's like the population going. There is no way of like not investing in global mobility right now, and I think like this is really something that is important, and we're also right now really diving deeper into the political landscape. This is something that we're also trying right now, because I do think right now like having advocates for immigration is important, and like really making sure that we talk more about like, okay, what happens if we don't fight the current climate. But that's a topic that I could speak about for a long time. Workations, and I know that I'm getting to the end of the time that was allocated to me, so I think we mentioned it quite a bit. One interesting statistic that we wanted to mention here, 71 days is the average of workation days that we've seen in the report that respondents have settled on, and it's interesting to see the industry, of course, has a big impact, really looking at like what is possible, like how much are they regulated, how conservative are they, etc. But I do think like they're right now like seeing that there is pressure to like rather increase that and like make things possible, especially within Europe. I think like that is one thing where we've seen a lot more companies allowing more days. And I think like also their business trips is actually an interesting one, because like right now return to office very often means that the employees don't have to be in a specific office to co-work there, but or like with a specific team, but actually the office is rather something like where companies say that they want to have like their culture footprint, etc. And so that is why like actually business trips to then visit your colleagues who are maybe in another city, but also for offsites, etc. Like this is something that's increasing, and so I think like they're again to shape that. This is another argument coming back to like the 2025 agenda, and just their like compliance risks. Compliance is a very interesting topic, but like really helps to push the topic up the agenda, because as we see, more than like half of the respondents will prioritize compliance above everything else, and I think like this is something that the wider businesses understand. Where does that leave us overall? The one very interesting finding for me was that 90% of all respondents agree that global mobility positively impacts employee satisfaction, retention, and business innovation. There is a high return on investment. And I do think right now, even if there's pressure on budgets, thinking about like how can we reallocate budgets potentially? What is like the return on investment? How can we help shape the business goals that are set? I think like this is really something that's super interesting. And also there again, like if anyone is interested in the topic, Lisa mentioned the roundtables that we're hosting, because I do think like now sometimes seeing what others are doing can help with creative ideas. And just a bit of a summary for the takeaways. I think that they're really now, even though the economic climate is still challenging, I think like their international expansion is becoming like top of mind again, making moves on a global stage. So I do think like there we have an interesting way in. Closer to the office, return to office, but it doesn't mean that there's, that it like has to go back 100% to pre-COVID times. So I think like there is still that angle where we see more mobility, and also on the policy side, I think like really looking at what are the constraints that the company is working under in terms of like compliance, the industry, regulation, etc. Where do we have locations, and like also what do we actually need for which team? Because I do think sometimes we still think a lot in like how was global mobility before and like how were things done. but I think that now we have a chance to really like look for different ways, which is very exciting to me. Also there, I quoted it quite a lot, the report with some interesting insights, interesting quotes. Also always happy to hear your feedback on there. If there's another area that we should cover. And now, I promise I keep our monologue short. And now I wanted to welcome Sebastian from Remote on stage. Big thanks to Remote for also being a sponsor of today, making all of this possible, and very excited to hear a bit more from you now.